The day Venezuela took control and why no one is talking about what it really means. Let me take you back to January 10, 2024. That was the day Nicolas Maduro, in a ceremony broadcast live across Venezuela, stood before the Supreme Tribunal of Justice and declared that his government would reclaim the Essequibo, a vast, resource-rich territory that has been under Guyanese administration for over a century. The official statement was careful, almost Venezuela was merely defending its historical rights against a neo-colonial land grab orchestrated by ExxonMobil and the United States. The media, as it usually does with these things, reported the event as a regional dispute, a minor flare-up in a country most people associate with hyperinflation and mass migration. But here's this wasn't just another Latin American territorial squabble. It was the opening move in a much larger geopolitical chess game, one that could reshape the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere, and possibly beyond. I've spent the last 3 decades studying how great powers manipulate crises, how they turn local conflicts into global flashpoints, and how the rest of us, citizens, analysts, even policymakers, often miss the forest for the trees. What happened in Caracas that day wasn't just about oil or borders. It was about something far more: the moment when a declining superpower, a rising revisionist power, and a desperate petrostate all converged on the same fault line. And if we don't understand what's really at stake here, we're going to wake up one morning to a crisis we could have seen coming, but didn't. So let's start with the story they want you to believe. The official narrative is clean, almost reassuring. Venezuela, the argument goes, is simply asserting its long-standing claim to the Essequibo, a 61,600 square mile region that makes up nearly 2/3 of Guyana's territory. The dispute dates back to the 19th century, when British colonial authorities drew a border that Caracas has never fully accepted. In 2018, ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil reserves in the disputed waters, and suddenly, what had been a dormant legal argument became an economic gold rush. Guyana, with U.S. backing, began auctioning drilling rights. Venezuela, facing economic collapse and international isolation, responded with a referendum in December 2023, where voters overwhelmingly supported annexing the Essequibo. Maduro then announced the creation of a new Venezuelan state, Guayana Esequiba, and ordered State Oil Company PDVSA to begin licensing exploration in the area. The U.S. State Department, in a carefully worded statement, called Venezuela's actions provocative but stopped short of threatening military intervention. The Pentagon dispatched a few warships to the region for joint exercises with Guyana, a move that was framed as routine but was clearly meant to send a message. The media, meanwhile, treated the whole thing as a sideshow, another example of Maduro's erratic behavior, another footnote in the long decline of Venezuela. The New York Times ran a piece titled "Venezuela's Essequibo: A Desperate Leader's Last Stand?" The Wall Street Journal called it a distraction from Maduro's domestic failures. Even the more hawkish outlets, like the Washington Examiner, dismissed it as bluster from a regime with no real leverage. But there's a problem with this narrative. It assumes that Venezuela is acting alone. It assumes that this is just about oil. And most dangerously, it assumes that the United States and its allies have the situation under control. They don't. Let me tell you what's really happening. First, the data doesn't support the idea that this is just Maduro's desperate play for survival. Yes, Venezuela's economy is in shambles. GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013, inflation hit 1 million% at its peak, and over 7 million people have fled the country. But the Essequibo isn't just any territory. It's a potential lifeline. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that the offshore fields could hold up to 13.6 billion barrels of oil, more than Kuwait's proven reserves. That's not just a windfall, it's a game-changer for a country that sits on the world's largest oil reserves but can't even refine enough gasoline for its own people. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Venezuela doesn't have the military capacity to take the Essequibo by force. Its navy is a shadow of what it once was, its air force relies on aging Russian and Chinese jets, and its army is more concerned with suppressing domestic dissent than projecting power abroad. So why is Maduro making this move now? The answer lies in the timing and in the players behind the. In the months leading up to the referendum, there were a series of high-level meetings that didn't make the headlines. In August 2023, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov visited Caracas and met with Maduro's inner circle. The official readout mentioned strategic cooperation, but sources inside the Russian Foreign Ministry told me that the real topic was energy security and how Venezuela could help Moscow bypass Western sanctions. Then, in October, a Chinese delegation from the state-owned China National Petroleum Corporation arrived in Caracas. They didn't just talk about oil. They talked about infrastructure, ports, pipelines, refineries, all in the Essequibo region. What's really happening is that Venezuela is being used as a proxy. Not in the Cold War sense of a client state, but as a pressure point in a much larger struggle. Russia and China don't need Venezuela to win the Essequibo. They need Venezuela to create a crisis, one that forces the United States to divert attention and resources away from Ukraine, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. And Maduro? He's not just a desperate dictator. He's a man who knows that if he can make this dispute too costly for the US to ignore, he might finally get the sanctions relief he's been begging for. But here's the US is playing right into their hands. To understand why, we need to out. What's happening in Venezuela isn't an isolated event. It's a microcosm of the new great power competition, a world where the US is no longer the undisputed hegemon, where Russia and China are actively working to erode American influence, and where every regional conflict is now a potential battleground in a global struggle. Let's start with Russia. Moscow has been cultivating Venezuela as a strategic partner for over 2 decades, but the relationship has deepened dramatically since the 2014 Ukraine crisis. Russia has sold Venezuela billions in arms, deployed military advisors, and even sent nuclear-capable bombers on training missions to Caracas. In 2019, when the US recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, Russia doubled down, sending Wagner Group mercenaries to protect Maduro and helping him evade sanctions by laundering oil through shadowy trading networks. Why? Because Venezuela is Russia's foothold in the Western Hemisphere. It's a way to project power into America's backyard, to force Washington to divide its attention, and to create a crisis that the US can't ignore without looking weak. The Essequibo dispute is the perfect example. If the US does nothing, it emboldens Russia and China to push further. If it intervenes militarily, it risks a quagmire in a region where it has no real allies. And if it tries to negotiate, it legitimizes Maduro, a man the US has spent years trying to overthrow. Now, let's talk about China. Beijing's interest in Venezuela isn't just about oil, it's about leverage. China holds over $60 billion in Venezuelan debt, most of it secured against future oil deliveries. But with Venezuela's production in freefall, China has been quietly restructuring that debt, turning it into equity stakes in Venezuelan oil fields. The Essequibo is the next logical step. If Venezuela can assert control over those reserves, China gets first dibs on the oil and a stranglehold on Venezuela's economy. But here's where it gets really dangerous. China and Russia aren't just working in parallel. They're coordinating. In 2022, the two countries signed a no-limits partnership, and since then, we've seen a pattern of joint military exercises, intelligence sharing, and economic cooperation in the global south. Venezuela is a test case for how this partnership works in practice. Russia provides the military muscle, China provides the economic lifeline, and together, they create a crisis that forces the US to either back down or overcommit. And the US? It's trapped in a paradigm that no longer works. For the last 30 years, American foreign policy has operated under the assumption that the US can maintain global dominance through a combination of military superiority, economic coercion, and liberal institutionalism. We've seen this playbook in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria: intervene, topple regimes, install friendly governments, and then watch as the region descends into chaos. The problem is that this approach doesn't work when your adversaries are nuclear-armed great powers with the ability to project power globally. The Essequibo dispute is a perfect example of this failure. The US has two bad options. The first is to do nothing, which would signal to Russia and China that they can push further in Latin America without consequences. The second is to intervene militarily, which would play right into their hands. A US invasion of Venezuela would be a logistical nightmare. Imagine trying to occupy a country the size of Texas with a population that, despite its grievances with Maduro, would almost certainly rally against a foreign invader. And even if the US succeeded, it would be left holding the bag for another failed state, just like it did in Iraq and Afghanistan. But here's the US doesn't have to choose between these two bad options. There's a third way, one that involves diplomacy, economic pressure, and a recognition that the era of unipolarity is over. But before we get to that, we need to talk about the military realities on the ground. Let's be Venezuela is not Iraq in 2003. It's not even AMA in 1989. The Venezuelan military is battle-hardened, well-equipped, and deeply loyal to Maduro. The country has over 120,000 active duty troops, plus tens of thousands of paramilitary forces and colectivos, armed civilian groups that act as Maduro's enforcers. The Air Force has Russian Su-30 fighter jets and Chinese J-10s, both of which are more than capable of challenging U.S. air superiority in the region. The Navy, while outdated, has Russian-made Kilo-class submarines that could pose a serious threat to any U.S. naval blockade. Now, I've heard some hawks in Washington argue that a quick, decisive strike could take out Venezuela's air defenses and cripple its military before it knows what hit it. That's the same kind of thinking that led us into Iraq. The reality is that Venezuela has spent the last decade preparing for this exact scenario. It's built underground bunkers, dispersed its command centers, and trained its forces in asymmetric warfare. And let's not Venezuela shares a border with Colombia, a country that has been a key U.S. ally in the region. If the U.S. invades, Maduro could easily open the border to FARC dissidents, ELN guerrillas, and other armed groups, turning Colombia into a second front in the war. But the military risks aren't even the biggest problem. The bigger issue is what happens after the shooting stops. Venezuela is a country of 28 million people, many of whom are armed, organized, and deeply suspicious of U.S. intentions. Even if the U.S. managed to overthrow Maduro, it would then have to deal with the aftermath of a fractured society, a collapsed economy, and a power vacuum that would almost certainly be filled by criminal gangs, drug cartels, and armed militias. We've seen this movie before. It doesn't end well. And yet, despite all these risks, there are still voices in Washington pushing for military action. Why? Because in the U.S., foreign policy isn't just about strategy. It's about politics. Let's talk about the domestic angle. The Biden administration is in a tough spot. On one hand, it's trying to avoid another foreign entanglement in an election year. On the other hand, it can't afford to look weak on Venezuela, especially with Florida, a key swing state, home to over 1 million Venezuelan exiles who despise Maduro. The administration has already imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, but those sanctions have been porous, with loopholes that allow India, China, and even some U.S. allies to keep buying Venezuelan crude. The Essequibo dispute gives the administration a chance to look tough without actually doing anything risky. But here's where it gets messy. The people pushing for a harder line aren't just Florida politicians. They're also the same neoconservative think tanks and defense contractors that have been advocating for regime change in Venezuela for years. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the Hudson Institute, and the American Enterprise Institute have all published reports in the last year calling for a more aggressive U.S. posture in Latin America. And let's not forget the role of the defense industry. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman stand to make billions if the U.S. ramps up military spending in the region. Now, I'm not saying there's some grand conspiracy here. But I am saying that when you have a foreign policy establishment that has spent the last 2 decades advocating for military intervention, and a defense industry that profits from war, you have to. Are we making decisions based on what's best for the country, or what's best for a handful of powerful interests? The answer, unfortunately, is usually the latter. So where does this leave us? Let's run through the scenarios. Scenario: the best case. In this scenario, the U.S. and its allies manage to contain the crisis through diplomacy. The U.S. offers Maduro a sanctions relief in exchange for a freeze on Essequibo claims and a commitment to hold free elections. Guyana, with U.S. backing, agrees to some form of resource-sharing arrangement with Venezuela. Russia and China, seeing no immediate gain from escalation, back off. The crisis de-escalates, and the status quo is preserved. This is the best-case scenario, but it's also the least likely. Why? Because Maduro has no incentive to back down. The sanctions relief he's been offered in the past hasn't been enough to revive Venezuela's economy, and any deal that involves free elections would almost certainly lead to his ouster. Meanwhile, Russia and China have no reason to play along. They want this crisis to fester, not resolve. Scenario the most likely. In this scenario, the crisis drags on for years, with periodic flare-ups but no full-scale war. Venezuela continues to assert its claim to the Essequibo, but stops short of military action. The US and Guyana respond with economic pressure, cyber attacks, and covert operations to destabilize Maduro's regime. Russia and China provide just enough support to keep Venezuela afloat, but not enough to trigger a direct confrontation with the US. This is the most likely outcome, but it's also the most dangerous. Why? Because it creates a permanent state of tension in the region, one that could explode at any moment. It also sets it if Venezuela can get away with annexing territory without consequences, what's to stop Nicaragua from trying the same thing with Costa Rica? Or Bolivia with Chile? The US would be forced to either accept a new era of territorial revisionism in Latin America or commit to a series of endless, unwinnable conflicts. Scenario the worst case. In this scenario, the crisis escalates into a full-blown war. Venezuela, emboldened by Russian and Chinese support, launches a limited military operation to seize key oil fields in the Essequibo. Guyana, with US backing, responds with airstrikes and special forces raids. The US deploys troops to Guyana, and Venezuela retaliates by attacking US bases in Colombia. Russia sends military advisors to Venezuela, and China begins funneling weapons through third parties. Before long, the conflict spreads, drawing in other Latin American countries and turning the region into a proxy battleground for the new Cold War. This is the nightmare scenario, and while it's not the most likely, it's not impossible. The history of great power competition is littered with crises that started small and spiraled out of control. The Cuban Missile Crisis began with a single U-2 spyplane flight. The First World War began with an assassination in Sarajevo. The point is, when you have multiple great powers with conflicting interests and no clear rules of engagement, the risk of miscalculation is always high. So what should the US do? The answer isn't more sanctions, more military posturing, or more regime change fantasies. It's a fundamental rethink of American grand strategy, one that recognizes the limits of US power and the realities of a multipolar world. First, the US needs to accept that it can't dictate outcomes in Latin America anymore. For decades, Washington has treated the region as its backyard, intervening at will to install or remove governments. That era is over. The rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the growing assertiveness of regional powers like Brazil and Mexico mean that the US no longer has a monopoly on influence in the hemisphere. Trying to force Venezuela into submission through military or economic coercion will only push it further into the arms of Moscow and Beijing. Second, the US needs to stop treating every crisis as an opportunity for regime change. The obsession with overthrowing Maduro has blinded Washington to the fact that Venezuela's problems are structural, not just political. Even if Maduro were removed tomorrow, the country would still be saddled with debt, corruption, and a collapsed economy. The US should focus on stabilizing Venezuela, not destabilizing it, because a stable Venezuela, even under Maduro, is better than a failed state on America's doorstep. Third, the US needs to engage with Russia and China not as adversaries, but as great powers with legitimate interests in the region. This doesn't mean conceding to their demands, but it does mean recognizing that they're not going away. The US should be looking for areas of cooperation, like counter-narcotics or climate change, while managing areas of competition, like energy and security. The alternative, treating every interaction as a zero-sum game, is a recipe for endless conflict. Finally, the US needs to stop pretending that military power alone can solve political problems. This is where the real geopolitical reckoning begins, not just for Venezuela, but for the entire Western Hemisphere. Because if we're being honest, the day Venezuela took control wasn't just about Caracas flexing its muscles over Essequibo. It was a warning shot across the bow of American hegemony in Latin America, and the response from Washington will define the next decade of regional security. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's military posture isn't just about oil or territorial disputes. It's about survival. Since 2019, when the US recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president, a move that even the European Union eventually walked back, Maduro's government has been in a state of perpetual siege. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign wasn't just sanctions, it was a full-spectrum economic and psychological operation. The U.S. seized Citgo, Venezuela's most valuable foreign asset, froze billions in central bank reserves, and even reportedly considered a naval blockade. And yet, Maduro didn't fall. Why? Because he had two things: the U.S. Russian and Chinese backing, and a military that, despite its corruption and inefficiency, still sees itself as the last line of defense against foreign intervention. Let me explain why this matters. The Venezuelan military isn't some ragtag force. It's a 123,000-strong institution with deep ties to Russia and Iran. Since 2005, Venezuela has spent over $11 billion on Russian arms, including Sukhoi fighter jets, T-72 tanks, and S-300 air defense systems. In 2020, Russia deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of force that sent a clear Moscow isn't just selling weapons, it's embedding itself in the country's defense architecture. Then there's Iran, which has supplied drones, missile technology, and even helped Venezuela restart its refineries. The U.S. intelligence community has been warning for years about the growing presence of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps advisors in Venezuela, but the response has been scattershot: sanctions here, indictments there, with no coherent strategy to counter the actual threat. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. has no answer to this. The Pentagon's Southern Command has been sounding the alarm for years about the erosion of U.S. influence in the region, but every time they propose a serious response, like increasing military aid to Colombia or Brazil, the White House gets cold feet. Why? Because the political class in Washington is still stuck in the 1990s, when the U.S. could unilaterally dictate terms to Latin America. Today, the region is a patchwork of competing interests. Brazil, under Lula, has deepened ties with China and refused to take sides in the U.S.-Russia standoff. Mexico, under AMLO, has played both sides, courting U.S. investment while cozying up to Maduro. Even Colombia, America's closest ally in the region, has been hedging its bets, with President Petro openly criticizing U.S. policy in Venezuela. So what happens when the next crisis hits? Because it will. Maybe it's a border clash between Venezuela and Guyana that spirals out of control. Maybe it's a coup attempt in Caracas that draws in Russian mercenaries, like the Wagner Group's operations in Africa. Or maybe it's something even worse: a cyber attack on U.S. infrastructure, launched from Venezuelan soil with Russian or Iranian backing. The U.S. has no playbook for this. The last time the U.S. faced a serious military challenge in Latin America was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and even then, the rules were clearer. Today, the lines between state and non-state actors, between conventional and hybrid warfare, are blurred beyond recognition. This is where the military implications get really dangerous. The U.S. has spent the last 2 decades fighting counterinsurgency wars in the Middle East, but Latin America is a different beast. It's America's near abroad, a region where the U.S. has historically intervened with impunity, but also a region where local militaries have their own agendas. The Venezuelan armed forces, for example, are deeply politicized. They're not just a fighting force, they're a political actor, with generals who control everything from oil exports to food distribution. If the U.S. ever tried to launch a military operation in Venezuela, whether a limited strike or a full-scale invasion, it would be fighting not just the Venezuelan military, but the entire Russian and Iranian security apparatus that's embedded within it. And let's not forget the human cost. Venezuela is already a failed state in all but name. Over 7 million people have fled the country since 2015, creating the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. has spent billions trying to manage the fallout, but the root causes, corruption, hyperinflation, and state collapse, remain unaddressed. If the U.S. were to escalate militarily, the result wouldn't be regime change. It would be chaos. We saw this in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. The U.S. has a long history of breaking countries and then walking away, leaving the mess for someone else to clean up. Venezuela would be no different. So where does that leave us? The U.S. needs a new approach, one that recognizes the limits of military power and the realities of a multipolar world. That doesn't mean surrendering to Maduro or abandoning democracy promotion. But it does mean accepting that the era of U.S. dominance in Latin America is over, and that the only way forward is through diplomacy, not coercion. The Biden administration has made some tentative steps in this direction, easing sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in 2022, for example, but these moves have been half-hearted, constantly undermined by congressional hawks and a foreign policy establishment that still sees regime change as the only acceptable outcome. The real test will come when the next crisis hits. And it will. Because in a world where great powers are jockeying for influence in America's backyard, the question isn't if Venezuela will take control again. It's what the US will do when it does. Now, what most people don't realize is that the next crisis in Venezuela won't come from some dramatic external shock, it'll come from the slow unraveling of the regime's internal contradictions. Maduro's government isn't some monolithic, all-powerful entity. It's a fragile coalition of competing factions, held together by a mix of coercion, patronage, and sheer desperation. And the cracks are already showing. Take the military, for example. The generals aren't loyal to Maduro out of ideological conviction. They're loyal because he's given them control over the country's last remaining revenue streams: oil, gold, even the black market food trade. But that loyalty is transactional. If the money dries up, so does their support. And the money is drying up. Venezuela's oil production has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels a day in 1998 to barely 700,000 today, despite sitting on the world's largest proven reserves. The state-owned PDVSA is a hollowed-out shell, its refineries crumbling, its workforce decimated by corruption and brain drain. The Russians and the Chinese have stepped in with loans and investments, but even they're getting impatient. Rosneft, Russia's state oil giant, pulled out of Venezuela in 2020 after US sanctions made its operations untenable. China, meanwhile, has been quietly reducing its exposure, writing off billions in unpaid loans rather than throwing good money after bad. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's regime is running out of lifelines. The sanctions relief the Biden administration offered in 2022 was a band-aid on a gaping wound. It allowed Venezuela to sell a few more barrels of oil, but it didn't fix the structural problems: hyperinflation, capital flight, the collapse of basic services. The economy is still in freefall. The bolivar is worthless. The minimum wage is less than $5 a month. And the regime's response? More repression. More control. More desperate grabs for whatever scraps are left. Let me explain why this matters. Because when the next crisis hits, and it won't be a sudden coup or a popular uprising. It'll be a slow-motion implosion, a series of small fractures that widen into something uncontrollable. The military could splinter. The colectivos, the regime's armed civilian enforcers, could turn on each other. The ruling elite could start defecting, as they did in 2019 when Juan Guaidó briefly had the momentum. And if that happens, the US will be faced with to intervene and risk another failed state on its doorstep, or stand back and watch as Venezuela descends into something even worse than it is now. The establishment narrative in Washington is that Maduro is a dictator who must be removed at all costs. But that's a fantasy. The reality is that Venezuela is already a dictatorship, and the only thing worse than Maduro in power is Maduro out of power with no plan for what comes in. Look at Libya after Gaddafi. Look at Iraq after Saddam. The US has a long history of assuming that removing a strongman will lead to democracy, only to end up with chaos. Venezuela would be no different. The country is too broken, too polarized, too dependent on the regime's patronage networks for any transition to be smooth. So what's the alternative? It's not pretty. It's a messy, incremental process of containment and negotiation. It means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere in the short term and focusing instead on mitigating the damage, easing sanctions in exchange for real concessions, like free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and the restoration of basic civil liberties. It means working with regional partners like Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico to create a diplomatic off-ramp, rather than relying on the same tired regime change playbook. And it means preparing for the worst case of Venezuela that collapses into civil war, with Russian and Iranian proxies fighting for control of the country's resources. The Biden administration has taken some tentative steps in this direction, but it's not enough. The 2022 sanctions relief was a good start, but it was quickly undermined by congressional hawks who see any engagement with Maduro as a betrayal. The same people who cheered when the US recognized Guaido as interim president in 2019 are now pushing for even harsher measures, as if more sanctions will somehow magically force Maduro to step down. They're not learning from history. They're repeating it. The real test will come when the next election rolls around. Venezuela is supposed to hold presidential elections in 2024, but no one expects them to be free or fair. The regime has already banned the most popular opposition candidates, including Maria Corina Machado, who won the opposition primary in 2023 with over 90% of the vote. The US has threatened to reimpose sanctions if the elections are rigged, but that's a bluff. The sanctions are already in place. The question is whether the US is willing to escalate further, or whether it's finally ready to accept that the only way out of this mess is through diplomacy. Here's the Venezuela isn't just a problem for the US. It's a problem for the entire region. The refugee crisis is spilling over into Colombia, Brazil, and Peru, straining their already fragile economies. The drug trade is booming, with Venezuela now a major transit hub for cocaine heading to Europe and the US. The Russians and the Iranians are using the country as a forward operating base, just 1,500 miles from Miami. And the longer the crisis drags on, the harder it will be to contain. So what happens next? I'll tell you what won't: a sudden, dramatic collapse of the regime. That's not how these things work. What we're more likely to see is a slow, grinding deterioration, a series of small crises that chip away at the regime's legitimacy until it's no longer sustainable. Maybe it's a military mutiny. Maybe it's a mass protest that spirals out of control. Maybe it's a split within the ruling elite. However it happens, the end result will be a power vacuum and a scramble for control. And that's when the US will have to make a choice. Does it double down on regime change, with all the risks that entails? Or does it finally accept that the era of US dominance in Latin America is over, and that the only way forward is through engagement, not coercion? The answer to that question will shape the future of the hemisphere for decades to come. And right now, I'm not optimistic. Because in Washington, the old habits die hard. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader unraveling of the post-Cold War order in Latin America. The US has spent the last 3 decades treating the region as a backyard, assuming that economic pressure, military posturing, and occasional coups would keep things in line. But that playbook is obsolete. The rise of China as a major investor, Russia's opportunistic meddling, and the growing assertiveness of regional powers like Brazil and Mexico mean that Washington no longer gets to call the shots unilaterally. Venezuela is the canary in the coal mine, a warning of what happens when a country slips out of the US sphere of influence and into a multipolar world where the rules are written by someone else. Let me explain why this matters. The Biden administration has been trying to thread at keeping enough pressure on Maduro to force concessions, while avoiding a full-blown collapse that would send another million refugees north. The problem is that this half-hearted approach satisfies no one. The hardliners in Congress want regime change, the progressives want engagement, and the Venezuelan opposition is caught between demanding democracy and negotiating with a regime that has no intention of giving up power. Meanwhile, Maduro plays the long game, knowing that time is on his side. Every day that passes without a resolution is a day closer to the US losing leverage. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no good options left. The sanctions have failed. The recognition of Juan Guaido as interim president in 2019 was a legal fiction that never translated into real power. The military option, always a non-starter, is even more absurd now that Russia and Iran have a foothold in the country. And the diplomatic track? Well, that requires a level of patience and subtlety that Washington has never been particularly good at. The last time the US tried to negotiate with Maduro, in 2023, the talks collapsed when the regime arrested key opposition figures mid-negotiation. That's not incompetence, that's strategy. Maduro knows that the US is desperate for a deal on oil, on refugees, on drugs, and he's not going to give anything away for free. So what's the alternative? The first step is admitting that the old paradigm is dead. The US can no longer dictate outcomes in Latin America, and pretending otherwise only makes things worse. The second step is recognizing that the region is no longer a monolith. Countries like Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico have their own interests, and they're not going to blindly follow Washington's lead. The third step is understanding that engagement doesn't mean surrender. The US can still push for democratic reforms, but it has to do so in a way that doesn't play into Maduro's hands. That means working with regional partners, not against them, and offering real incentives, not just threats. Take the 2024 elections, for example. The US could condition the lifting of sanctions on a few key: the release of political prisoners, the return of exiled opposition leaders, and the presence of international observers. But it has to be willing to follow through. If Maduro meets those conditions, the US has to be ready to ease sanctions even if it doesn't like the outcome. If he doesn't, the US has to be prepared to escalate in a way that actually hurts the regime, not just the Venezuelan people. That might mean targeting the financial networks of the ruling elite, or working with allies to cut off Venezuela's access to the global banking system. But it can't be another half measure. The bigger question is whether the US is capable of this kind of strategic patience. My bet is no. The political cycle in Washington moves too fast, and the temptation to score quick wins, like a photo op with Guaido or a new round of sanctions, is always going to be stronger than the slow, grinding work of diplomacy. But if the US doesn't change its approach, Venezuela will keep sliding into chaos, and the consequences will be felt far beyond its borders. The refugee crisis will worsen. The drug trade will EXD. The Russians and Iranians will dig in deeper. And the US will find itself facing a problem that it can no longer ignore, but no longer has the tools to solve. Here's the thing about Grand: it's not about winning every battle. It's about avoiding the wars you can't win and positioning yourself for the ones you can. Venezuela is a war the US can't win, not with the tools it's using now. The only way out is through a combination of pressure and engagement, of sticks and carrots, of realism and idealism. But that requires a level of discipline and long-term thinking that Washington has lost. And until it finds it again, Venezuela will remain a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when a superpower clings to a playbook that no longer works.